call our afternoon session to order. So good afternoon, everyone. Fran Inman, Chair of the CTC. I want to welcome you back to our afternoon session of our Transportation Policy Forum. So hopefully you all joined us this morning. We had a great discussion, made all our little wheels turning and thinking about how we all move forward together in the future. And it's not for a shortage of ideas, but I think we need to really continue the dialogue and continue to listen and learn. So with the listen and learn hat on, I would like to introduce our afternoon panel. And so today we are delighted to have Donna DiMartino, who's going to be our moderator. Donna serves as the San Joaquin Regional Transit Chief, and Donna is known to being one of the innovators and leaders in this sector. So delighted to have Donna here with a number of her colleagues in the transit world, helping us really look at the future. And question that I always have is, where's our ridership? Where's our ridership? Where's our ridership? So anyway, with that, I'd like to welcome Donna and thank all of our panel members in advance for a very exciting afternoon. So Donna, thank you.
Well, welcome back. I do understand that several people, especially those who work in the Sacramento area, have gone back to their offices and they may be watching us via the video conference, so please help me remember to check on questions from them. As Chair Inman said, I am the CEO at San Joaquin Regional Transit District. I'm delighted to be here to moderate this panel. I am sharing the stage with several of my colleagues and a new one, Austin from Uber. I've not met you before, but looking forward to calling him a colleague as well. I do want to let you know that panel 2 is called Evolving Challenges in Transit in California. And of course, you probably all know, if you have been following the trends in transit at all, that due to factors such as increased automobile ownership and other shared mobility options, transit ridership has experienced a decline in many communities. We have some great panelists here who are going to share what I believe are some intellectually provocative thoughts through the next few hours. I know that you'll enjoy hearing from all of them. This panel will discuss possible policy modifications to actively promote transit ridership while balancing the state's economic and environmental goals. We really learned a lot about resiliency this morning, and I hope this is going to build on it. I know it will, actually. Before I introduce the panel, I've been asked to share some of my own thoughts on the topic, and I want to bring up 2 points and then bring up a few questions before I get on with the panel. So, as we are discussing how to increase transit use, my first message will be, don't forget the bus. The last policy forum I was a part of talked about statewide rail projects, and those are really important. I love rail. As a matter of fact, I spent my first 14 years here at Sacramento, where I was part of the light rail startup team. But it's important to remember that buses are really a critical part of the public transportation network. As a matter of fact, the backbone of the public transportation network. They provide more trips than all other transit services combined at a lower cost per passenger. They operate in many cities that have no other transit services, cities where trains and ferries just wouldn't make much sense, providing services to people who can't afford TNC. So first of all, is there anyone in the room who doesn't know what a TNC is? Well, just in case anyone's too embarrassed to raise your hand, TNCs are transportation network companies. They're companies like Uber and Lyft and others. So we'll be talking about TNCs quite a bit today. But today we're discussing resiliency and ridership declines. It's been very easy to identify a few causes, and we like to blame the TNCs for taking away our riders. We know that the fuel prices are lower, and that has an impact on ridership. We know that especially in California, it's now easier to get access to a driver's license. But I don't believe that explains it all. An important part of the discussion is to note that at both the federal and the local levels, over the past 10 years, bus funding has been a challenge, leading most transit agencies to reduce service. In fact, if you take a look at the National Transit Database, the report that we all file annually, you will see some interesting correlations. There are about 18% fewer buses on the road, about 18% fewer service hours being offered, and about 18% fewer riders. But doesn't that make sense? Those are all connected. If you're offering less service, you're going to have fewer riders. So one of the points, and I know we're not supposed to really be discussing funding too much, but it is integrated into the conversation. So it's important to remember that we need to keep making those investments into bus systems and different types of bus systems. So the second point that leads into is that as our communities change, transit services are already changing to adapt to and meet the needs of our customers. This is no longer your parents' transit experience or your parents' transit service. The buses we're operating today are not the same as those we operated a generation ago. They're cleaner and they're safer. They have the latest technology features and they produce low or no emissions. We've come a long way. But it's not just the buses that are different, it's the service that's different as well. Transit agencies like RTD, when Uber and Lyft moved into our communities, we didn't resist them, but many of us established partnerships with them so that they could help us provide first and last mile connections to our fixed route services, as well as services to connect people when we weren't operating our services. In addition, many of us have started to provide Uber type services at public transit prices with accessible vehicles and certified operators. Another change is that with our new technologies and services, smartphones are no longer something that our customers just look at while they're on the bus. They're actually using them to get bus schedules, to get information about where the bus is, and now even to buy their tickets and to request a bus. So I was specifically asked to talk about San Joaquin's Van Go service. I want to let you know that San Joaquin County is a very large county, 1,400 square miles. We have some big cities, Stockton, Tracy, Lodi, Manteca, but we have a lot of urban or rural and agricultural land. And there's just no way we could possibly provide fixed route service everywhere in the county. And even though we have formed and found a good partnership with Uber, there aren't enough Uber vehicles available in San Joaquin County, especially accessible vehicles to meet the needs. So rather than tell you about Van Go, Yang is going to push the button and show you a little 1-minute video that will talk about our Van Go service.
Need an easy and convenient way to get around? Want to go to more places throughout San Joaquin County? Presenting RTD Van Go, an on-demand ride-hailing service where you can easily book a trip using the RTD Van Go app. What sets Van Go apart from other services? You can travel 7 days a week anywhere within the San Joaquin County, including Linden, Lockford, Thornton, and Clements. With Van Go, you know who's picking you up. Our drivers are professionally trained and verified with RTD's stamp of approval. All RTD vehicles are wheelchair accessible. At $4 per one-way trip, you and 3 of your friends can travel together conveniently and affordably. Discover the possibilities at sjrtd.com/vango. Transportation that's a work of art.
Thank you. So I could tell you about Van Go, but getting to see it was really so much more effective, I believe. I've had friends in the community, people in the community who don't ride transit at all, who have really paid attention now. This has attracted a lot of attention, and people say, wow, Donna, what a great idea. Well, mobility on demand was kind of my idea, but the Van Go marketing was really staff's idea, and they did a great job. So we're very, very proud of that service. I'd be happy to provide more information in the future. If you want, just contact me. But now I do want to get on to our main topic today. How would I encourage public transit ridership increases? And I would start by saying we need to remove some of the barriers. We've seen with the success of Uber and other TNCs that people want to go where they want to go, when they want to go. They want easy, intuitive services that are readily available for them for their mobility needs. Currently, public transit, even at the local level in most cities, is really not very easy or convenient for our customers to use. Figuring out our schedules and our fare collection systems, especially at transit stations, can be daunting. I have a graduate degree in transportation management. I've been in this industry 30 years. I get to BART, I look at the fare vending equipment, and I am perplexed. So are our customers too. So how do we remove that barrier? Fare figuring out how to work our system is very daunting, as I said. I am very excited. I saw there's Kyle, you have come back. Kyle is leading an effort, working with a team leading an effort throughout the state of California called the California Integrated Travel Program. It's really intriguing. You can learn more about it if you don't know about it by going to the Cal ITP, and you'll be able to pull up the website. But essentially, the idea is to create mobility options statewide so that people can travel around the state and plan and pay for their trips easily so they can get anywhere they want within the state. And the California ITP is really going in the right direction, but I'm wondering if there are some things we can do to support it along the way. And my questions are, is it possible to start with individual system building blocks that can support the statewide project? What can we do to provide easy and intuitive systems for customers to plan and pay to use our own local services? And then second, how can we provide intuitive and easy options for our customers to integrate into neighboring and statewide transit systems when their journeys take them outside of our service area? And then finally, let's see if it makes sense to integrate other mobility options, taxis, bikes, scooters, car sharing services with our public transit network to make it easy so that California residents can see public transit as a viable partner in meeting all of their mobility needs. So with that, I want to get on to an introduction of the panel. I think I'll introduce all three to begin with and then call them up individually. I want to start with Moses Stykes. He serves as the General Manager for the Fresno County Rural Transit Agency. He's been there over the past 5 years. He's responsible for management, operations, and leadership activities. And I said, Moses, I've known you a whole lot longer than 5 years. And he reminded me that he had a long stint with Caltrans and also the CPUC. Next to Moses on the stage, you see Doran Barnes, who has served as the Executive Director of Foothill Transit. He's been there 16 years? Wow, I've known you a long time too. And he's responsible also for the management, operations, and leadership activities within his organization. In particular, he leads an organization that was the first to introduce the brand new battery electric buses in the state of California. I sometimes tell him he was a bad influence on us because we were the second. Next on stage, we have Austin Hayworth. He serves as the Senior Manager of Public Policy for Uber, Jump, and is responsible for state policy and regulatory issues. When I looked you up, Austin, I found a cute little quote or an interesting statement. It said that you transferred your competitiveness as a former college quarterback into your current role in politics. And I think that's an interesting transition. So welcome. And then at the end of the stage there, we have Michael Pimentel, who serves as the legislative and regulatory advocate for the California Transit Association, and he is responsible for policies and programs that impact transit operations, air quality, and the climate. He's worked very closely with the California Transit Association and the Air Resources Board, working with us on the new innovative clean transit rules. And he also has experience with high-speed rail and formerly with the governor's office. So we have, I'm sure you would agree, a very talented and capable panel. So with that, let me invite you, Moses, up to the podium. We'd love to hear from you.
Moses. There we go.
Okay. Which one clicks it over?
This one right here. Forward, backward.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, and thank you very much. My hat's off to the commission and the staff for inviting a rural transit representative. It's not often that we get to talk about our systems. Predominantly, it's the urban systems, and I get it, the density and the trips and the volumes and the allocation of funding. But rural transit agencies play an important role in the entire California transportation aspect. I'm presenting this map to you for some of you who have not been to Fresno County. It's an interesting county, like most rural counties. And if you look at that target, that bullseye, there's some mileage distances at the top of that county line. It'll say 10, 20, 30. That's relative for what I'm going to present to you, because for us in the rural areas, it's all about distance, and we'll talk about that. But before I get into the presentation, I want to share with you a couple stories. I'll share one now, one in the middle, and one toward the end, just to kind of set the stage for this rural presentation. A little over a year ago, we had a call from a veteran, and he was up toward the Sanger area. If you look up on the map, I know it's small print, but it's up there toward the middle right hand, and it'll say Sanger, and to the right it'll say Squaw Valley. So we had this call from this gentleman. He happened to be a war veteran, and he needed transportation to get into Fresno for chemo, radiation therapy. And those intervals are 6, 8-week stints, 2 or 3, depending on the type of cancer. The gentleman had gone to Veterans Hospital in Fresno, at Clinton and Fresno Street. And interestingly enough, the oncologist who was treating this veteran referred him to an off-site clinic outside of the Veterans Hospital. And because of that, the Veterans Administration could not provide him transportation. Transportation could only be provided to on-site to the Veterans Administration, meaning at that particular site. So the gentleman called up, and technically we're not a medical transportation provider because that's under the auspices of medical transportation. So we could not technically provide it. We can't do school bus and or charter. Those are the 3 things. And no, I'm not asking for regulatory changes here, but it's one of those situations where sometimes you ask for forgiveness rather than permission. The gentleman told us that the quote he got from a private medical provider, one of the Metatrans vans, was $148 a one-way trip from his location a little over 20 miles outside of Fresno into the off-site admin clinic that he was going to go to for the treatment. We did it for $2.50 a one-way trip. And we did this transportation for this gentleman, which tells you the importance of not just him being a veteran, not just that healthcare plays an integral role in the connectivity of transportation, origination to destination, but really the weaving pattern that we do for providing transportation that's needed. And I know my colleagues here have similar stories, and I can relate to stories, and this is one that is very critical to us, and it really makes it very important in the role that we're doing. And I know it doesn't matter if it's urban or rural, but I just want to have you try to identify with a connection in some of the residents who live in rural areas as a choice. We can't tell them or ask them, get up and move and go to an urbanized area. We just can't do that. They have the right to live their quality of life in whatever community. And I think the panel earlier had talked about similar issues where you choose to live. These are the type of services that Fresno County Rural Transit agencies operate. By the way, we're celebrating our 40th year in operation. We started in September of 1979, so we're celebrating 40 years of service. We operate in 13 incorporated communities, 29 unincorporated communities, and we do have fixed routes within the inner cities of all the cities within Fresno County. We also thought it was important that we develop and maintain interregional services as well. And we do have 2 services that connect Kings County and Tulare County. And I'm going to go back to the map to show you the importance of that, not only intercity and intracity, but the interregional connectivity. If you look down to that arrow where it says Kingsburg, that is Tulare County down there, and then just to the left of there is Kings County, which also has another system that comes into Fresno as well. And the reason we have these interregional services, because some of the medical services and social services or other needs in some of these other smaller communities, even smaller than Fresno County, need to have access to other services as well. A couple of the programs that we started in 2007 was a rural transit program. We found that even though we provide inner city transportation with 7 or 8 routes, and we provide these 13 cities with anywhere from 1 to 4 ADA accessible vans, we thought that it was important to provide services to individuals who live outside the sphere of influences. Everything, as you know, is done for funding on an allocation basis based on urban, rural areas, and people are real funny about the funding. You know, they want Fresno County funding to stay in Fresno County, they want the regional rural funding to stay in rural, and they want the urbanized to stay in urban. That's fine. So what we thought, these residents outside the sphere of influence needed which really was kind of a first micro transit back in 2007, 24-hour advance reservation. Jose, you could call up and say, Moses, I need a ride, and I live outside the sphere of influence of Selma, and I need to go to Fresno for a doctor's appointment or get my prescriptions filled. So at the time, for $2.50, a one-way trip, you could get that ride 24 hours in advance and come into Fresno, or go to Selma to a clinic or wherever you needed to go. And now the price is $3 a one-way trip. We actually raised the price 50 cents, okay? So it goes to show you the type of services that are needed out there, and we have to be flexible to make the changes and accommodate the ever-changing landscape that's out there that affects our rural residents, and add to our existing inner-city and our intra-city routes as well. These are some stats based on what our ridership characteristics are, based on the many reports that we have to fill out, which is fine. As long as I continue to get the funding, we'll produce as many reports. No matter how high the stacks are, they're very worthwhile. But if you look at the Farebox recovery, it's at 12.01%. And I could say I'm very proud of that, because it's at 12%. For rural operators, by the way, it's a 10% recovery box of your operating expenses. For the urbanized operator, it's 20%. We're fortunate to have a local measure, Measure C in Fresno County, that we use discretionary funding, and we offset our fare box. We have many cities that the fare box is far below the 10%. If we were not able to augment and subsidize it, we would not be able to maintain this fare box. To further that, we offer free, subsidized, augmented fares to our rural passengers in the intra-city. The elderly and the disabled ride for free. So I could call up and get as many trips as I want to go anywhere inside of Selma, any one of those 13 incorporated cities, Kingsburg, Orange Cove, wherever. And it plays a key role, which also doesn't really help with our ridership in declining situation. Even with our augmented fares that are basically free for the elderly and the disabled, we still have a decline in ridership. So we're not exempt or immune from that. This is the CalEnviroscreen 3.0. How many of you are familiar with this screen? A lot of the funding applications use this. I know ARB uses it, San Joaquin Valley Air District, Caltrans, LCTOP, Patisma, all the major funding sources use this. Fresno County is about 92 to 98% in the higher echelon of the CalEnviroscreen. There's maybe one or two zip codes in the more isolated areas of Kalinga. That's about 62 miles southwest of Fresno, and in Kingsburg, a small little zip code that maybe don't qualify in the CalEnviroscreen. Also, for the most part, the population of Fresno County, they're all disadvantaged communities. Predominantly Hispanic population, over 50%, some average 80 to 90%. Many of the areas there do not have adequate or enough facilities, medical facilities. About 3 or 4 years ago, the state of California eliminated the courthouses in Fresno County, cost-saving measures. Well, guess what? If you have a warrant, bench warrant, or you have to go make an appearance, you still have to get to Fresno to make an appearance. Otherwise, they're going to come in looking for you and they're going to put you away. So transportation is really a catalyst, and it's it's connectivity for not only healthcare, but also other services that are needed in our society. One of the other things too I like to mention, which is not popular, there's a lot of parolees out there. There's a lot of heroin addicts, and all the methadone clinics are in Fresno. So they have to come in and get their synthetic heroin. It's something that it's not popular, but you know what? We need to have it because otherwise they're going to be out there breaking into homes, pulling armed robberies, and doing other things. So public transit really does a lot. And again, not to take away from the urban providers, we just have that added burden and the distance that we have to deal with, and also the time slots. This is our current vehicle fleet. We're not like Foothill or Donna at RTD. We're just starting in the CNG, and we feel like we're light years behind. We've got 23 electric vehicles. We've got CNG, and we've got gas. We've never had diesel-powered vehicles. I understand our goal or state mandate is 2040 to be in compliance, but we're trying to push to 2025, and we're still way behind. It's not easy getting there. It looks good on paper, it looks good on this PowerPoint, but you know what? We scratch our heads every day and wonder how we're going to get there. And I'll tell you a couple other reasons why we're scratching our head and really trying to think outside the box and pleading for additional assistance, and not just monetarily. In operating a zero-emission bus, and I don't know how much Doran's going to get into it, but I'm just going to highlight a couple brief things that we've had challenges with as a rural operator. And keep in mind that we've only got a staff of 4 people. We subcontract our services out for a fleet of 110. We were very proud of our operational system. We have 2 full-time mechanics, 1 supervisor, 2 detailers part-time, and 2 shuttle drivers for a fleet of 110, and we'll match it to anybody in the country. Our terminal's inspected and we get certification. Everybody comes to our site, where's your staff? We go, this is it. So we run pretty lean and mean. The drivers have to get specialized training. The vendors don't provide that for you. Basically, it's here's the vehicle, have a nice day, when are we going to get payment? Especially when you're dealing with $800,000 vehicles, right, Donna? Infrastructure has to be in place to allow charging in other cities where the vehicles are stored. This is going to be a real challenge, and it has been, and I'm going to get into that in a little bit here. We were the first county in the state, if not the country, to put in solar arcs. These are solar charging units in public locations in the 13 incorporated cities. They don't have any direct access to any of the building or the grid. These are strictly standalone. The units are 9x12 solar panels. They weigh approximately 900 pounds, and we have one in every incorporated city, usually at the city hall, with the exception of 2 locations that are at a library, public library. It's great because guess what? They're CEQA exempt, overriding considerations, discretionary review and approval by any director because you're not breaking ground, and they're basically not contributing to any detrimental aspect of the environment. And we're very proud of this feat, and we're looking at putting in some solar trees eventually. And those are 32 by 32 panels, a little larger, and hopefully they go as well as these go. The charging infrastructure and installation, we've had a real interesting challenge with this because we don't own any of the properties. Our vehicles are stored at 13 municipal yards, so it can be a challenge. Fortunately, we have an exceptional relationship and an agreement with these agencies because they're part of our JPA. Every mayor in the incorporated cities sits in on our board of directors, so we have pretty good access to these municipalities. However, we do have to do some improvements there. Security lighting, cameras, automated gates. I don't know how many of you are from municipalities, but they're pretty much in dire straits to get improvements at any municipal yard. Sometimes they have more challenges than we do as transit operators, and that's saying a lot. So we work with them to try and develop a real collaborative partnership as well. Recently, I don't know who here is from Caltrans, but Caltrans, thank you. We applied for a planning grant to analyze the grid system in Fresno County. And you're probably asking, Moses, why are you now just analyzing the grid system after you've deployed 23 electric vehicles? Well, sometimes the horse comes before, or the cart comes before the horse. And we're finding out that we've had some very trying times trying to get some chargers installed, not the solar units, because we don't have to tap into the grid and we don't have to do direct connections to the existing grid system. So we were fortunate enough to put in this grant application so that we can assess the current grid capacity in Fresno County. This grid capacity is not just going to benefit us as the primary transit operator, but it's going to help our municipalities, the individual cities out there, the engineers, some of the other projects that are going on out there. PG&E is our primary utility provider. We do have a couple of borderline utility companies. They're more of the gas, which is SoCal Edison down toward Kingsburg and Reedley, but for the most part it's PG&E. We even got a letter of support from PG&E, and we hope to take advantage of this partnership as well. This study is going to really tell us three things. One, the existing grid system and the capacity. Two, the deficiencies. And lastly, what is needed to mitigate some of these impacts or additional load on the system that we as a transit operator, one, are going to propose. Two, how the municipalities are going to convert over too. So it's really interesting with that regard, and we hope that this study is conclusive in another 18 months. And once we conclude it, we're going to make it available for everybody else who wants to use it as a boilerplate so that they can make the same assessment whether it's rural or urban area. We have another study that is coming around too for the rural transit system, and I'm going to get to the end here, try to wrap up real quick. Some of the challenges to transit, the cost to implement the EVs, electric vehicles, it's unknown at this time, and we've got 23 in operation. I know Doran's going to talk to that. Donna's experiencing that. There's really no uniform platform on a lot of levels to get into this new technology, and the lack of uniformity by vendors. A lot of things are proprietary, and I get it. It's all about the money, the bottom line, and keeping your secret so that you can make more money. But for us transit operators, we're just trying to provide a basic service so that we can make it easy and uniform. Let me go on to the next one. Transit decline in ridership, we've talked about that. That's one of the key points of this conference. And ridership for us has declined 7.15% for seniors, disabled 5%, and the general public about 2.14% in spite of those free and augmented fares. Health providers are also providing a lot of transportation. And the long distances for these trips in rural areas for the disabled and elderly, they're very trying on them, regardless of their condition, whether they have a walker, a cane, or an oxygen tank, or other mobility devices. A couple things I want to cover. The partnerships with other providers, colleges, clinics, social services, and also we need to conduct inventory of what's existing out there. Review the federal and state TDA and STA regulations, and implement non-traditional mobility on demand transit services to improve the lives of the transit, which I'm sure Austin's going to get into as well. And these are the three policy recommendations. And what we want to do is encourage non-traditional mobility modes in the rural areas. There's a lot of challenges out there, and it's not because there's no TNCs out there, it's the profitability is not there and the distances. If there is a TNC provider out there, it's because they took a trip from Fresno out to one of the rural communities. So it's not cost effective as of yet. We want to promote investment in large-scale infrastructure analysis of existing conditions, and also as mandated by CARB, by other state agencies. And lastly, we want to modify and or amend state statute to allow rural transit operators to really receive additional vehicle miles traveled in reverse of that other CEQA bill for vehicle miles traveled versus mitigation under CEQA. if we operate electric vehicles. Also allocate additional funding as necessary to maintain this operation. Thank you very much.
I believe we'll hold our questions until the end, but thank you, Moses, for giving us the rural transit perspective. I think it's really important. The story you shared about the veteran trying to get to a medical appointment and being told a trip would cost over $140, that is reality. And we as transit agencies are able to help in many cases. Our ADA services have been helpful to many people in our community. And while they help, they don't answer all the questions because ADA services are only required within 3/4 of a mile of fixed route services. So what happens if you live outside of that 3/4 of a mile? And Moses and others will keep bringing up limited resources because it does have an impact on our ability to provide services. I liked what you said about operating lean and mean. I think all of us, no matter how big we are, I think Doran will tell us he operates lean and mean as well. And I think you'll hear woven through our comments a discussion about electric vehicles and the innovative clean transit rule because it does play a part in how we as transit agencies move forward because it really does have an impact on all aspects of our operations. So now let's move from rural Fresno to the big LA County, and Doran Barnes, please come on up.
This one right here is yours.
That's it.
Okay. This is to forward, backward.
Okay, great.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Donna. It's a pleasure to be here today. I have the honor of interacting with Chair Fran Inman on a pretty regular basis, given that we both work in the San Gabriel Valley. And we've sort of gotten into a bit of a cadence with each other. Before I even say hello to her, I say, "Fran, send cash." And Fran replies and says, "Where's the ridership?" And so I think that sort of ties to this whole discussion. Foothill Transit, just by way of background, we are the primary fixed route transit operator in the San Gabriel and Pomona valleys of Los Angeles County. Our service area encompasses Pasadena to the west, out to Pomona and Claremont to the east, and all of the cities in between. About half of our service goes from those suburban communities into downtown Los Angeles. Fairly big service area, 22 cities in the Joint Powers Authority. And as you see on this slide, the bulk of our fleet is operating on compressed natural gas, but we do have 33 electric buses in our fleet. And as Donna mentioned, we were the first to implement a fast charge heavy-duty transit bus and have continued to expand our fleet and have learned tremendously as we have gone through this journey over almost a decade now. One of the keys for us is that as a relatively young transit organization, innovation is very much part of our mission. We were created to be a bit different in terms of how we operate, and we've tried to apply that as we continue to move forward in terms of our current service model. Now, I was actually going to start this presentation talking about our electric bus program, but again, I think ridership is really the key. And you can see here that on this chart, and the numbers don't really matter that much, but essentially we've gone from a high of 15 million boardings this year to 12.5, and that number's projected to actually decrease again next year. So ridership, when we look at the environmental benefits, when we look at the mobility benefits, when we look at trying to reduce vehicle miles traveled, what we're seeing is a downward trend. And while this chart is unique to Foothill Transit, it's really not that different in terms of what you might see from other operators across the state of California and across the country. So really it is a question that Fran, you need to keep asking, because the real key is, where is the ridership? What are we doing in terms of trying to turn those numbers around? And it becomes a very complex and challenging problem. In many respects, we're operating on infrastructure that we don't manage or control. 50% of our buses run along the I-10 corridor from the San Gabriel Valley into downtown Los Angeles, and yet we have no control over the operation of that freeway system. There is an HOV lane. It's now largely a hot lane or a toll lane that runs through the corridor, but it's often congested. So it's hard to sell someone on using public transit as a quicker mode of transport when the reality is it really isn't quicker, and yet we don't control how that lane gets operated. One of the things that we are trying to do is change the ride experience for our customers, because we know that to some extent, particularly our choice riders, if we can give them a different type of experience, if we can give them a very enjoyable ride, hopefully that will attract them and give us something we can add to our portfolio in terms of our ability to sell the product. So one of the really cool things we're working on right now is an electric double-deck coach, and I'm going to talk more about our electric bus program here in a second. But this particular coach, one of the reasons that we're looking at this is not only because it's electric, and we do expect it to be the first electric double-deck bus to be introduced into revenue service in North America, but also the double-deck factor, the ride quality, the ride experience, the street presence for that matter. We actually had a demo of this particular bus in a diesel configuration, and it's something that people really notice. In fact, when we did the demonstration, we had a lot of folks come out specifically to ride on this bus. Again, what we're trying to do is something that really changes the ride quality. The real key point in this particular element when we're thinking about policy and policy recommendations is that anything we do really has to start with ridership. And when we think about the broad spectrum of transportation, I think we often tend to get focused on very specific elements. But if it doesn't come back to ridership, we can be running all kinds of fancy new tech buses that ultimately have good things happening, but if nobody's coming through the front door, there's really no point. So that's point number one. Now, in terms of our electric bus, I'll share with you a little bit about our electric bus experience. And again, we were the first to launch a heavy-duty fast charge electric bus. We launched that vehicle in September of 2010. We have almost a decade of operation with those vehicles. And what was particularly unique about this first group of buses is that the first 16 buses were fast charge buses, meaning we can charge those buses from a 5% charge to a 95% charge in less than 10 minutes. It's roughly a 5 to 7 minute charge time per cycle, so we can get a lot of energy on that bus very, very quickly. The downside is that bus has about a 40-mile range. So essentially, we have to be charging that bus about every 2 hours in order to keep it running throughout its service day. We could literally run that bus 24 hours a day, 7 days a week without ever taking it offline because we're constantly charging it. Now, if you think about utility rates, which is something I never thought I'd have to learn about, but we as transit operators are suddenly learning a lot about utilities and electric power. When we're charging that bus at 8 o'clock in the morning, electric rates are relatively low, not a big deal. But when we have to charge that bus at 5 o'clock on a hot August afternoon, we can literally see a tenfold increase or shift between the lowest point of electric power in the day and the highest point. And right now, with this particular configuration, we don't have the luxury of being able to tell our customers, gee, it's hot today, we're just going to shut the transit system off. So certainly a learning that we've had in terms of how this has all come forward. From a technology standpoint, we expected to have lots of technology challenges, and the technology has actually worked quite well. It's really a matter of how do we get the economics behind it to support that. I'm going to tell you a little bit more about our charging stations, in part to illustrate the learning process that we've gone through, and it gets to the next couple of recommendations I have for you. We've been operating, again, this fleet of fast charge buses for 9 years now. We're now moving into extended range buses, and the compare and contrast is with an extended range bus, we can get about 190-mile range on the vehicle, but it takes longer to charge the vehicle, so we don't get that quick burst of energy. We're operating these buses on our line 280, different route, a local route that we provide from the city of Azusa down to the city of Industry. One of the keys to keep in mind with this vehicle that we've learned is that while the bus has a 190-mile range, and I see in my slide I've still got the 251-mile nominal range, it's actually 150 to 190-mile actual range. That compares to a CNG bus, which has almost a 350-mile range. So with this particular bus, if you ever have experienced any kind of range anxiety dealing with an electric vehicle, we experience range anxiety with these buses. With a CNG bus can pretty much get through anything we needed to do during a service day. With the extended range electric bus, we can't get through an entire service day on some of our vehicle assignments. So again, a piece of information that we've learned as we've gone forward. The other thing I'll note, and I will change this next time I use this slide, the 251-mile nominal range, while that was touted by the manufacturer as a nominal range, what that means is if the bus is moving at a consistent slow speed, about 10 miles an hour, on the test track with no customers, no air conditioning, it can get 251 miles. Last time I checked, that's not how we operate buses. And probably if you were riding with us, that's not the way you'd want to travel. So if you see that number, if you see that nominal range number, it really is not a real-world operating condition, and it's important that we're making decisions based on those real-world, unexpected operating scenarios, because every day is different in terms of what might be happening in terms of service. Now let me show you here a picture of our initial charging station. This is a charging station that we built, again, back in 2009, 2010. This lovely building here that we built with the charger sitting in front of it, there's actually a charger on either side. This building sits at our Pomona Transit Center. That combined charging infrastructure cost $2 million to install. It's a lovely building. It even has its own street address. 100 and a half is the street address for that particular building. Fast forward, when we deployed our next group of buses, this is the charging station that replaced that $2 million charging station. And if you can see it, that little box there that looks kind of like a couple of refrigerators sitting next to each other with the poppies on it, that replaced that $2 million building with a charging facility that cost $1 million. We learned a lot. We're going in the right direction. What we subsequently learned, though, again, as I mentioned earlier, is that because we're charging at both of these locations throughout the day, that demand charges and utility pricing make both of these solutions really infeasible as we go forward. Okay? So it's part of the learning process. Again, it's a matter of trying things and seeing what we learn. But the key point I want to make here is that we've gone through that learning process and we found that $2 million can be done better with a $1 million solution, and really even the $1 million solution doesn't get you there. That's one transit agency's experience. If we had every transit system in the state go through that same exercise, think about the amount of resources that would be consumed to go through that learning. That's a lot of resources that potentially could be redeployed to doing different things. Now, as we go forward here, this is a picture of our Irwindale operating facility, our Arcadia Irwindale operating facility. This is 20 acres. So what I showed you in the last two slides were charging stations for 2 chargers. Here we're trying to develop a charging infrastructure for 200 buses over 20 acres of land. This is what we hope it will look like. In terms of examples of this in North America, if we were to go and find out who has the best practice in North America, or even in fact in Europe, where would we go? Nowhere, because it doesn't exist yet. We're doing what hasn't been done before. And that's kind of the cool thing, in that we're doing what hasn't been done before. But again, we want to make sure that we're being as smart as we can, but I can almost guarantee that $2 million, $1 million learning curve, we're going to repeat that. And as an industry, we're going to repeat that a few more times as we ultimately figure out what is the best solution, how do we do this the most cost effectively. In terms of overall cost for this program, the question I would ask is, are you willing to pay 7% more for a zero-emission transit bus fleet? 7% doesn't sound like a lot, right? But for us, that's $13 million a year for the next 12 years through full deployment. And if you look just at Los Angeles County, if you add in Long Beach Transit, about the size of us, that's another 13. And you add in Santa Monica, that's another 13. City of LA, that's another 13. LA Metro, they're 10 times our size, that's $130 million. And that just took care of LA County, and there's still other operators to be involved there. So it's a lot of money being invested in terms of moving forward with this important technology initiative. And the key is we need to try to drive those numbers down, but ultimately there are going to have to be resources dedicated to achieving the innovative clean transit rule that's been put forward through the California Resources Board. So that leads me to 2 recommendations, and I'm kind of cheating because I'm going to take a 4th one here, but I'll make it quick. One is that, again, think of that $2 million, $1 million scenario. There needs to be strategic funding with key learnings behind this so that we can go through that learning curve as a state and do it smartly. We don't need every transit operator making the same mistakes or going through the same learning curve. Mistakes isn't the right word, but going through that same learning curve, we need to be smart with how we do that and how we support that. Because ultimately, the first solutions are not going to be the best solutions because of the things that we're going to learn. So that's that's the second thing. The third thing is the thing I always tell Fran. Send cash. Ultimately, it's going to take resources to achieve this goal. It just is. If we're going to move forward with achieving the ICT rule, it's going to take resources. And we have to be realistic about how we allocate our resources and what our aspirational goals are. We're all in. We're committed to moving forward with an electric fleet. We think it's important. We want to get there, but it's going to take the resources to make that happen. The other thing that I would just park out there and point out is that this whole piece where I've talked about our electric bus fleet really doesn't have a whole lot to do with the ridership question. This has to do with the tailpipe, and the tailpipe's important, but none of it builds ridership. None of it gets us to the point of actually growing our ridership. So again, just something to park out there as a thought. Again, we're committed to going all electric by 2030. We're very anxious to continue to move forward. We're willing to push the envelope. But as a medium-sized transit operator, as with all transit operators, the resources to do these things are limited. We have to be smart as a state in terms of how we go forward and ultimately achieve the goal that we're trying to achieve. The last thing I'll leave you with is a quick note about costs and particularly about Farebox. You heard the discussion about Farebox and the challenges with Farebox. Again, I think as you look across the state, Farebox is an interesting question. There are certainly lots of ways that Farebox can be dealt with and managed, but what this chart shows is the increase in our cost per service hour, and we're actually one of the lowest cost per service hour transit operators in the state. But there are other things that certainly have impacted us. The $15 an hour minimum wage, which again is an important thing, but that's also driven up our costs. So costs have gone up, but our ability to charge our customers has been challenged. What this chart shows is what those cost increases are reflective to our actual fare box. And you can see that our fare revenues have actually gone down, our ridership has gone down, but our costs keep going up. Again, the point I want to make here is that if we're really concerned about growing transit ridership, if we're concerned about reducing vehicle miles traveled, Farebox probably is an antiquated concept that perhaps we really ought not hang our hat on anymore. And that's my last recommendation, is that we really need to get away from Farebox being the driver of what we're doing and reposition what our goal is relative to growing transit ridership and all of the benefits that come along with that. So with that, I've got my bonus point in, and Donna, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you so much, Doran. I really appreciate your comments. And you brought up some very good points. How do we convince people to ride public transit when we can't make it any faster? You know, and that's something we can look at a statewide level. If our buses are sitting in the same lanes as all the other vehicles, it's really hard for us to say, you can get there quicker and cleaner on us. Cleaner maybe and a little bit more convenient, but we could use some help with getting our buses on dedicated rights-of-way that will help us operate more quickly. And I appreciate the questions about electric vehicles, zero-emission vehicle deployment. That's a big issue, something we really need to take a look at. What is the real cost and where are those resources going to come from? Because while we're leaning in, I think Doran and I have the largest electric vehicle fleets in the state. We're believing in it, but identifying the resources is really, really difficult for all of us. And then I think we're going to switch over. So thank you, Doran. And then we're going to switch over now. And Austin, when I was talking earlier, I talked about how we're now providing our own mobility on demand options. I talked about the value of bus transit. Bus transit's really important. Buses and trains operate really well in high density, high capacity corridors. And our little mobility on demand services that we're offering in our communities are really important to those communities. When Moses talked about that veteran getting to his medical appointment, and many of the people who live in our disadvantaged communities, they can't afford Uber. However, I believe Uber is a really important part of the transportation network, and I'm eager to hear what you have to say about how you see Uber's part in this. So welcome Austin, please. Thank you.
Okay, this is too forward, backward.
Great.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you to the Commission for including us today, and I'm glad I kind of batting cleanup after a couple of folks went before me, because I always like to tie back sort of these new, yet to be kind of proven out concepts back to personal experience. I actually grew up in Monrovia, California, right in the middle of Foothill Transit's kind of service zone, and so Uber, like many things in the mobility space, looks very different in a highly urban place like San Francisco or downtown LA. It looks a little different in a kind of mid-sized suburban area like where I grew up in the San Gabriel Valley. And it looks a lot different in more rural areas like Fresno. And so all these things, I think, you know, while San Francisco is a more mature and built-out market, it's interesting to kind of think how it translates to these other things. And a lot of these concepts or sort of trends we're just now learning about. So just for context, Uber's gotten large in the last decade. It started here in California, and really here in Sacramento was the first place that we were regulated. but it's worth pointing out how this is expanded to now we're over 70 countries. We've done over 11 billion trips. We do about 16 million trips a day in 600 cities around the world. So seeing how some of these trends translate, into other cultures and other sort of regulatory markets where mobility looks a lot different is interesting because it can provide some insights about how we think about, where California is going and how this could be improved, and we can kind of, steal some lessons learned from other markets. And the rider base is huge. So when we think about the integration with transit and sort of new forms of mobility, it's important to note that this is something that can be tapped into to get a lot of people's eyes and attention and behavioral patterns, connected to that very, very quickly. One thing we learn about mobility is that it's not just price, it's also convenience. And that's one thing that, we think we can play a role in terms of, new transit investments, how we can tie in that growing convenience economy concept that so many people are staring at their cell phone every day. How can you turn that into a tool for good that actually brings quick marketing and attention to the things that are being invested in? So Uber's changed a lot over the years. Like I said, it basically started in 2009, but really didn't start in the form that most people know it until about 2013, when California first kind of created a regulatory space where you started seeing what we call UberX, the more widely accepted kind of commercial version where it's not just black cars, it's Priuses and everything else. And since then, it's grown very quickly. But I think in order to sort of have the privilege of continuing to grow, we recognize that we need to find new ways to integrate with the existing infrastructure we have out there and really make the best out of transit. And so I'm excited to kind of pivot here towards some of those things, but we are changing very, very quickly. I just think that's something really to underscore because we're obviously self-aware and understand there's a growing sort of tension with transit about what is the real effect of TNCs in these marketplaces. Is it competing with and sort of eroding transit use? I think the message I would like to deliver is it's really just more complicated than that. Of course, any individual may report in a survey that I've taken a TNC when otherwise I would have taken transit. But really the ultimate evil we would say is personal car use. That's not sustainable, nor a direction I think that anyone here thinks we should be going in. And so really the way we think about the direction and future of our company is competing with that, not competing with public transit. And really, I'm happy to provide some of the private sector perspective here about what we think that can look like. Still, it's very early days, we're learning, but I'm really excited to be part of this conversation. And I think we certainly welcome all kinds of new ideas because we've experimented with some, but by no means do we have it all figured out yet. But there's some science behind it. And so this is sort of what we think in terms of how we kind of sell our impact on certain cities. Is personal car ownership, as you can see at the bottom, is sort of the baseline for a metric that we use. We refer to it as emissions or impact per passenger mile. So how efficiently are you moving people compared to other alternatives? And I think that 80% of trips in California, and that trends largely the same across the country, is 80% of trips, an individual says I'm going from A to B, are in a personal car driving themselves. And only about 2% of those trips are happening on transit. We can point out that shared mobility, like rideshare, especially when you get more than one person in the car with a traditional pool service or a competitor's Lyft line, is a lot better. And as the fuel efficiency of those vehicles, obviously trending towards fully zero emission vehicles, is even better. And so an electric vehicle is great. An electric vehicle with many people in it, more butts in the seats is even better. And we want to figure out new ways that we can actually trend in that direction. But still, the impact of transit, for the most part, is going to be your best, most efficient tool in moving people. And obviously, people biking or walking, when it's most convenient, is really, there's no way you can actually compete with that from a congestion and environmental and a sustainability perspective. So the trend is, how do we get people out of personal cars and into other means of mobility? We obviously run a car service, a on-demand ride-sharing service that most folks are familiar with. More recently, we've invested in the micro-mobility space, which I'm going to touch on a little bit here. You can go right outside and see the red jump bikes and scooters. And Sacramento's got a really unique, awesome story to tell about that. And we're also getting into the high occupancy vehicle space. If you think about people leaving the Kings game or a concert at the Golden One Center, it's a lot of people in one place going in one direction. It makes a lot of sense to use a higher occupancy vehicle that's going to obviously reduce VMT and put more people in a more cost efficient and just more sustainable concept. And so it's sort of the next rendition of things that we're moving towards. And so how do we think about our role there? Uber can be an integrator. And so this does not mean that it needs to be all things we own and operate. It's playing a role in actually connecting people. And the way I like to put this is, unfortunately, let's pretend I don't work for a tech company. This was an interactive sort of slide that actually showed how this would move and flow in the app experience. But if you see on the left there, it actually shows real-time pricing and ETAs of transit, pool, and UberX. And in Sacramento, actually, if you open up your Uber app, it'll also show a bike and how quick you can get from A to B in a bike. And so this goes back to the point I was making about how do you change behavior patterns, right? You can kind of build, I'm sure my folks that run transit agencies could say, you can have the perfect solution in place, but you still can't change people's behavior, right? And so in that sense, the one thing that we know and have a lot of market experience in showing is if you put it right in front of somebody's face to show that going from A to B in one way is not only cheaper, but going to get you there quicker, that actually changes people's behavior patterns. And we have early insights in really what drives those factors. And so if you think about, I like to use the example again, going back to personal experience, in Sacramento, for example, if I'm at the Capitol and I want to go towards Midtown, ordering an Uber is not your best option to get going from that A to B. You're basically going to drag a driver off the freeway to drive deadheading, on one-way streets, 14 blocks to pick you up at Chicory, and then drive you 5 blocks. It's not good from a congestion or a sustainability perspective. It's not good for the driver's economics. They'd rather stay busier driving people to the airport and making more money. And it's a better use of transit. It's going to reduce, the traffic on the streets. If people know, slap you in the face, it's a lot better for you to take a bike 2 blocks, get on RT and take that the rest of the way. Like I said, by no means is that built out as sophisticated as we think it'll be in the years ahead, but we view that as a real solution in partnership with transit agencies. It's going to make people at scale kind of make the right decision about how a city should move. Moving on here. So a little bit about Sacramento. I said I grew up in Southern California, but I've lived here for 8 years. It's really exciting because Sacramento has some of the coolest, sort of most innovative concepts going on all at once. So we brought Jump here in May of 2018, so we only have about a year of data. But within 6 months, we were doing more Jump trips in Sacramento than Uber trips. And so the quick growth and adoption of that has been really remarkable. Obviously, if you're riding a bike around, there's some seasonality to that. People don't like to ride in the rain and probably not in 108-degree weather. But the interesting part is because of the pedal assist electric actual component of this, on a hot day in business attire, it's actually more realistic to see people getting on a bike because they're not actually fully pedaling themselves. The cooler part is you can't see, it's kind of in small print, but the red represents Jump trips, the blue represents our vehicle trips, is the trend actually offsets car trips during the most congested periods of the day. So at the worst times to be ordering a car off the freeway to drive you 6 blocks is when we're actually seeing people choosing the option of bikes more regularly. That's good for us because we're also seeing trends like in San Francisco where we've integrated Jump in our rideshare business, people are spending 15% more time on the app, so they're doing more business with us, but they've had a 10% reduction in their actual vehicle trips. And so it's actually cannibalizing our own business, which I know some folks in the transit space like to think we're doing to them as well, but it's a good thing in that we can get people to go to one place as a one-stop shop for mobility, but bring all options into the table in which it actually kind of sorts it out and makes the right decision most obvious to you. It actually is interactive. All right, never mind, we got half of it right. So the next sort of step here, while this is still early days, is actual full integration with transit, not just what we call journey planning. There's lots of apps that can do that. You can do that on Google Ways of saying, what's my best option going from A to B? But actually being able to do ticket purchasing in the app. So I go to San Francisco a lot. I don't even own a car anymore. I gave it to my brother to sit in the traffic on the 210 down south. But, sorry, but going back to the convenience concept is I would take an Uber from my home a mile or two to the Amtrak station, hustle really quickly to type in my credit card information, and then try to figure out what my best option is once I got into San Francisco. We think in a couple years ahead, you'd be able to just press one button and it would sort all that out for you. So you'd get an Uber at your house in 5 minutes, your ticket would be bought on Amtrak. When the Amtrak times, it actually times it out with a reserved bike or a car already waiting for you. You'd get a call saying, sir, ma'am, I'm Mike with Uber and I'm here to pick you up. And so that experience will change behavioral patterns. I mean, it's still kind of a to be determined concept, but we're really excited about that possibility. And you can only imagine if you could link that with flight travel, how much more efficient it would actually make airports. It would reduce VMT in areas that are really congested. It's just a really exciting concept to try to build around. And that's an example of in Denver, This is pretty recent. Only about 2 months ago, we sort of launched our first full integration with RTD in Denver. As sort of a proof of concept thing, we put a huge wrap around the train itself to show folks that you could actually order this train on Uber. So in addition to things we're seeing here, like the ability to get a bike or a scooter, you can actually order the train, A to B entirely on the Uber app. And we've already seen, I think still the trend line is actually up. Last time I talked to my folks that run this, but we're seeing 42% week over week growth in the people using this. So it's pretty incredible to tap into that sort of static user base of people that are going to see that option and slowly for whatever use case is most regular for them, start to transition, their multimodal choices. Really quickly here, this is a little bit more of the science of how we think about this. This was developed because of legislation from last year that was led by Senator Skinner, which at first was an effort to say, let's turn all the Uber and Lyft drivers into electric vehicles, which has a lot of sort of pitfalls on how we would operationalize that. We don't own vehicles, but we can create certain incentives and change certain things that do change behavioral patterns. And so what this ended up transitioning into is we're working with the Air Resources Board over the next handful of years to reduce our emissions per passenger mile as a platform. And so what that means is we can use sort of this engine of efficiency of fewer vehicles on the road, putting more butts in the seats, as I mentioned, so actually transitioning more towards like our pool product and making those vehicles more efficient. The sort of subtext of this is we get bonus points if we put people onto public transit or onto a bike or a scooter. And so showing that we can actually make that connectivity in the app obviously counts as another leg of fully zero emission miles that helps us reduce, from a regulatory standpoint, what will be viewed as our overall impact in terms of a VMT basis. And so that's what we actually think landed. It ended up being great policy. What was initially something that was really troubling to us ended up being something that's sort of a blueprint for what we want to spread to other markets. As this is really how you should view our business. How efficiently can we move people compared to the other alternative? Really the personal vehicle being, the ultimate evil there. So a few trend lines around this. Accessible transit, there was another piece of legislation passed last year that's going to encourage us to put more wheelchair accessible vans on the road via a fee on every trip. You're now paying a dime on every Uber and Lyft trip that goes in to fund this effort. We have already been doing this. While it's still early days, that's one thing I know transit agencies have struggled with for a long time because it's very difficult to run a really efficient paratransit service. Our technology layered on top of that spend and that effort can make people aware of exactly when can I count on a vehicle being here and how can I actually plan my day around this, something that the disability community has struggled with for a long time. Complementarity in transit is really the first mile, last mile concept that I'll get to. And I've got some great case studies to point to later. On-demand public transit, while it pains me, our competitor here in the United States has a partnership actually with my hometown in Monrovia, where they do this. They have basically on-demand service that is sort of supplemented, not replaced, their bus lines. The more close to home example is if you go to West Sacramento, they've partnered with Via, which is sort of a competitor of ours, and they do door-to-door publicly subsidized service that has been widely adopted. It's a cheaper, more efficient way to run a transit service when a bus line, a fixed bus line may not make the most sense. That doesn't mean it needs to compete directly with it, but you can complement the fixed line, higher utilization routes with what has become obviously this widely accepted idea that you can get a car at your door in 5 minutes for a relatively affordable cost. And then there's data behind this. While this is a developing and ongoing effort, we've had lots of conversations with lots of different transit agencies across the state, but the truth of the matter is we have a lot of data that can help inform planning and help kind of prove that the investment that we're moving the direction we're moving in is actually playing out. And that points back to the effort to integrate with public transit. Potential transit benefits, obviously, as I kind of underscored, we can increase ridership, which I know is a goal of everybody here, lower the cost of doing so, and just improve the overall customer experience of that convenience that I was speaking about, and eventually extend the reach of transit by people actually deciding and knowing with some level of confidence that they have the ability to make sort of first mile, last mile decisions. Really quick here, just to give you an example of that.
It's already preloaded.
Cities are growing and changing, and this growth has an impact on how we get around. To help address these challenges, we are introducing a new product, Uber Movement. By leveraging anonymous GPS information from hundreds of thousands of online Uber vehicles, Uber Movement provides a new way to show how traffic is really moving around your city. Uber Movement was designed in partnership with urban planners and transportation professionals and provides powerful tools to analyze traffic changes over time. Over days, weeks, and years, patterns emerge and help inform decisions for your city. Uber Movement offers access to the insights you need to make smart choices for your city today and tomorrow.
All right, I need to wrap up here. I apologize for going long here, but a couple of case study examples of the themes I just discussed. So using Uber Movement, which you can access, any of you can access if you have an Uber app. Right now, I think it's built out in LA and San Francisco, as well as about 50 other domestic and international cities. But this is a case study of what was shown when London expanded their night tube, which is basically the late night service of expanding their fixed rail operation. As soon as that happened, without any actual formal contract or partnership in place, we were able to share data that showed that instead of the majority of trips happening in central London, we had a huge shift almost overnight once this happened of late night pickups towards these sort of more terminal transit hubs, because people were actually changing their behavior to actually be able to do a first mile, last mile operation, taking that last mile or two back to their home at late night. And so it actually really enhanced the investment the city was making there. Obviously, I know most transit has fixed costs and can't always expand a 24-hour service, but we can help expand upon that and actually share the insights of how that trends. I'll speed through this as well. On-demand transit, of which I talked about, we have a few examples of really interesting sort of early data-backed experiences with cities that have transitioned away from a low-performing fixed transit network towards using our service as a complementary resource to their residents. And that first mile, last mile late night service is another thing that we'd be eager to talk to more transit agencies about. And accessible transit is another thing that is something that certainly has a lot of force behind state law right now, and something that we're really eager to build out more partnerships with California cities. And lastly, as I mentioned, I'd be eager to show folks or have our teams come and meet with anybody to kind of show how this looks like in the app and sort of what is kind of next on the frontier of what can be made available in terms of making that sort of behavior change be backed up by the user experience in our app. So I will stop there.
Well, I think you'd agree Austin had some really good information to share with us. I sure appreciate it. I think I would fit into the active rider category you mentioned, especially when I'm in a city other than my own. And I went to Paris with my granddaughter, and I was able to use Uber to get around. Even when I couldn't speak to the driver, I could get from point A to point B. So I appreciate you sharing with us the different options, and it is important to remember that different circumstances require different options, and we certainly can operate successfully within the same space. So thank you very much. Our last speaker is Michael Pimentel from the California Transit Association. In case you don't know, the California Transit Association represents most, if not all, of the medium and large systems throughout the transit systems throughout the state, as well as many of our business relation partners as well, our manufacturers and our business and supplier partners. So they've been very active with the Air Resources Board, the Innovative Clean Transit, and many, many other legislative and regulatory matters for us. And Michael Pimentel has been kind of the head of the spear on many of those. So I'm eager to hear what Michael has to bring to us. So please help me welcome Michael.
All right, good afternoon. Thank you, Donna, for the introduction. As Donna mentioned, I'm Michael Pimentel with the California Transit Association, where I'm a legislative and regulatory advocate. Now, Donna hit on some of the overview that I was hoping to provide on who the California Transit Association is and what we do. We've got 200 transit-affiliated members in all, and that is nationwide. We represent about 80 transit agencies within the state of California itself, and those agencies collectively provide about 90% of the transit trips that happen in our state. What we do chiefly is advocate for policies and funding solutions that support and advance public transit. In recent years, we were tip of the spear for things like Senate Bill 1, where we're able to secure about $700 million annually in new funding for public transit operations and capital, as well as being the chief negotiators with the California Air Resources Board on the development of the Innovative Clean Transit Rule. Now, I'm going to go over some information that may appear a bit rote, but just bear with me. What is public transit? I want to make sure that we have a base level fluency over what public transit entails, because I think that informs a conversation of what the mobility ecosystem will look like in the future. So just first, the definition. And this is taken from Article 19 of the California State Constitution. It's surface transportation services provided to the general public or complementary paratransit service that is provided to persons with disabilities pursuant to the Americans with Disabilities Act. Now, we operate on bus, rail, ferry, or other means of conveyance that may be rail, and we operate on fixed routes or at times through demand response, and of course a fare is generally charged for our service. Now, transit agencies are not monolithic in terms of their organizational structure, and I think this is important because it speaks to some limitations that may exist for transit agencies as they try to venture into new territories. May they be automation or partnerships with shared mobility providers, but we take the form of either cities and counties, that could be LADOT, SF Muni, Joint Powers Authorities. There are two that are up there currently on the stage. Special transit districts, those would be transit agencies that are defined in California state statute, or we may be private or nonprofit organizations, and our workforce can be fairly varied. We can have in-house staff, contracted staff, or we may be a blend of the two. The vehicles, of course, are familiar: bus, light rail, heavy rail, commuter rail, intercity rail, ferry, and paratransit. But of course, the challenges that we face in those traditional modes is fairly significant. Now, everyone has heard about transit ridership being in decline, and in fact, in the last year, transit ridership declined by about 2%, and that's across the dominant modes. That would be bus, light, and heavy rail. The only mode that we did see an increase in transit ridership was for commuter rail. And as I acknowledge this point, I'm going to stipulate that most casual observers will say, well, there's been the emergence of Uber and Lyft, and that makes sense. They're taking your ridership, and there are a few headlines that kind of point to that position. But what I'm here to say is that it's not all Uber and Lyft. In fact, the issue, as I think Austin correctly noted, is just car ownership, period, and our over-reliance on the automobile. Now, there are a variety of reasons why car ownership is increasing. In the state of California, we enacted AB 60, which allows undocumented folks for the first time to obtain California's driver's licenses. And UCLA, and studying the SCAG region down south, found that that was one of the dominant reasons why transit ridership is in decline in that area. Now, we can talk about the righteousness of this policy, but understand that it does have a very real impact on transit ridership. One of the other dominant factors that appears to be impacting transit ridership is just the suburbanization of poverty. We've got a housing crisis in this state, as you all know, and as urban centers become increasingly unaffordable to low and medium income folks, they're being pushed out into suburban, exurban, and rural areas where transit service isn't necessarily as robust. And in order for them to get to their jobs or to school, they're having to buy vehicles. And that's a real problem that we're seeing across the state and across this nation. So what has the response been from transit agencies? Well, a number of agencies have chosen to tackle this issue in a variety of ways. Some have done comprehensive operational analyses where they're looking to better fit their service to the populations that they now serve. As you all know, as cities grow, as gentrification happens in certain pockets, people migrate. And what may have once been really strongly supported service based on the data may turn out to be fairly different several years out. At the same time, agencies are looking at partnerships with private operators. They are looking at new technology. And one of the items that I was asked to speak to in particular are partnerships with micro transit providers, but also know that transit agencies are exploring partnerships to address things like first and last mile travel, that would be to and from stations or stops. They're looking at ways to reduce the cost of their service and boost the efficiency. And they're also looking to replace or augment low-performing lines, and I'll speak to that in just a moment. And they're also looking at ways in which to expand service beyond the traditional hours of operation, oftentimes through partnerships with the transportation network companies. So speaking in particular to micromobility, I'm going to highlight two options, or rather two examples for you. The first is Sacramento Regional Transit's Smart Ride service. Now this launched in February 2018 and provides on-demand door-to-door service to folks within specified service boundaries. And the service operates much like Uber or Lyft. You pull up an app, you select your point of origin, your point of destination, and provided you're within those boundaries, Smart Ride will come to you and take you to that place. And the service is provided in-house, and when I say in-house, I mean with SAC-RT vehicles and SAC-RT trained drivers, and it's supported by Transloc software. Though reservations can be made on smartphone, as I just noted, you can also do it online or via the phone, and this is just a means of addressing the equity issue for folks who may be unbanked or who may not have a smartphone. Fares are set at $2.50, which is the base fare for SAC-RT service, and of course there are discounts for folks that are seniors, persons with disabilities, as well as students. And here are their service boundaries. Now when it first started, it started in the Citrus Sites area of Sacramento, and then very quickly radiated out to Antelope, Orangevale, and Fair Oaks, and they have connecting service to the historic Folsom Light Rail Station. More recently, with the infusion of some more funding, they were able to expand to Franklin Boulevard in South Sacramento, where they're providing service that was otherwise, I'd say, previously anemic. The results have been fairly strong. They've seen steady ridership growth since that program launched in February 2018. And customer feedback has generally been very positive, with folks noting just greater satisfaction with the service in terms of reliability, in terms of convenience. And for SAC-RT as an operator, they found that it's been easier for their dispatchers and operators to navigate, because now they've got new, more advanced technology that allows them to pick up and drop off their riders. And we have seen also a decrease in trip denials by SAC-RT as an operator, as well as fewer trip cancellations or no-shows for the riders themselves. And I'll note that when the service first launched in Citrus Heights, it was meant to replace an existing on-demand service called City Ride. And they were averaging something on the order of about 30 rides per day. With this new service, they're averaging about 250 rides per day, which is a fairly significant increase. So they went from 30 to about 250 rides per day. So it's a sevenfold increase, or eightfold increase in the service that they're providing, with largely the same budget and with largely the same technology, but they've infused the introduction of the Transloc software that allows for more seamless integration. Now, I will note that these results are very context specific and will vary across agencies, and that's to say that this shouldn't be viewed as just a silver bullet you can apply to any context and expect the same results. And as proof of that, we'll go to AC Transit in Alameda and Contra Costa, where they're headquartered in Oakland. Now, they launched a service that's very similar to Smart Ride called Flex. And that started in July 2016. It too provides on-demand service, but with a twist. They're going to and from specified bus stops and really looking to supplant an existing fixed route service known then as Line 275. Now the service is provided in-house. Reservations are made via smartphone online or via phone. And they also introduced the ability to reserve a ride in person. Because they're starting at station stops, as well as BART stations, they're allowing folks to just show up to the curb and enter one of these vehicles and follow a fixed route. Fares are set at $2.50, which for them is also the base fare for their service, and discounts are provided to seniors, persons with disabilities, as well as youth. And here are their service boundaries. Those red dots there are the various points where they will pick you up or drop you off. Now the results have been a bit more mixed. They've completed 23,000 trips in all. They've found that there has been increased frequency to certain stops because they're now making fewer stops in between because they are something that is demand response as opposed to a purely fixed route. And they found that customer feedback is by and large positive. 94% of riders who use Flex prefer it over the fixed route service that it replaced. But one of the things that has been challenging is that they found that service averages about 3 passengers an hour. That's half of the number of riders that they had on their then fixed route service. And because the cost of providing that service is the same, but they've got fewer passengers, the cost per passenger has actually more than doubled. So we might ask, and AC Transit has kind of discussed internally, has this been a success? And there would be some would say, well, costs have gone up per passenger trip. No, AC Transit has decided that because there is increased convenience, there is improvements in the quality of life for their riders, that it should be viewed as a success. They've also found that it can be used for a new use case, and that's that if they're looking at expanding traditional fixed route service into new territories and they want to get a sense of what ridership might be, they can start off with a flex service, determine whether or not this service would necessitate a fixed route, and if they find that service far surpasses what they're finding on the existing flex service, they may move forward with traditional service. So it's a way of planning for fixed route service that allows them to make adjustments if necessary. Now, one of the other items I was asked to speak to is increased integration across transit agencies, and that would be around integration with fare payment and trip planning. On this graph here, you'll see that here's the history of where we've been. Cash and paper tokens, magnetic strips, card-based systems like what you experience here in Sacramento if you use the Connect card, or in the Bay Area with the Clipper card, or Los Angeles with the Tap card. And many agencies are now moving toward these account-based systems or open payment systems, which can allow you to use things like contactless payment. That might be your Visa or MasterCard that you have in your wallet, or your Google or Apple Pay that you've got on your phone. And the state of California is in fact trying to encourage this a bit more. Now, we've heard a bit about the California Integrated Travel Plan from Donna, and want to just highlight a bit more of what that project is looking to do. It's being run again by the state of California and overseen by the California State Transportation Agency. I see Chad Edison in the crowd. I see Kyle from Caltrans in the crowd. They've been tip of the spear for the state in advancing this project. And what it's looking to do is to create a unified system of fare payment and scheduling across the entire state, so that we can have one system for migrating across modes and geographies. So if you're here in Sacramento, and I'll often take SacRT to the Sac Valley Station and hop on the Capitol Corridor to get down to the Bay Area, I might have one form of fare payment to migrate across those systems. And the theory there is by making these services easier to use, you've removed a barrier of entry for the use of these services, and you should see an increase in transit ridership. Now, if this is successful, and we hope that it will be, you'll see that the type of payment options that folks will have will be increase the type of multi-agency access that you would be able to have through this system will increase over plan systems in areas like the Bay Area, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Sacramento. We think that this is a project that is completely worth the interest of all folks in California, because it is something that, if you look at the research, it shows that by making transit easier to ride, it can boost transit ridership. Now I'm going to turn quickly to some of the ways in which you as decision makers, advocates, can support buoying transit ridership. And I'm going to deviate a bit from the items that I just discussed, micromobility and fare integration, because I think that we focused a lot on technology, and Doran kind of hit on this. That's not the silver bullet that we need. There are certain things that we can focus on that are proven strategies, they're low cost, that can really measurably improve transit ridership. And as proof, I'll just give you this. There are 35 of the largest metropolitan regions in the state that are on this graph, and only 7 in which transit ridership is increasing. And I've got them noted for you here. And in these areas, what they've done to boost transit ridership are fairly simple solutions. They've taken on comprehensive operational analyses for their systems. They found ways to introduce things like bus-only lanes that decrease trip times. And this has led to a sea change in their ridership within their service territories. And so my view is, let's get back to the basics. Let's focus on what really drives transit ridership. There are things like increased frequency of service, decreased travel time, increased reliability of service. These things which sound so basic, but which the state has not necessarily focused on in making a reality to make sure that we can boost transit ridership. So my first recommendation would be to support policies that improve the quality of transit service. Now I know it's kind of a hot button issue to just say increase funding for transit operations, but if we can increase transit service levels, we can increase transit ridership. And then there are certain things that we need to address because they fall outside the purview of transit agencies, outside of the things that they can necessarily control themselves. They often fall to the municipalities in which they operate, or in the case of operations on the state highway, but that need to get done. The creation of bus-only lanes, the authorization of the use of buses on highway shoulders, and also the establishment of things like traffic signal prioritization. All these things decrease travel time. All these things make sure that transit can compete with automobile travel, and therefore it increases the attractiveness of transit and will buoy transit ridership. The next recommendation would be to support policies that improve the financial appeal of public transit. Now, transit ridership generally suffers because we haven't enacted the right policies in place to really put into place the price signals that will force folks to reconsider taking their automobile over taking public transit. And so we would urge the state and local governments to mandate that employers provide commuter benefits. This was a recommendation that was in last year's CTC recommendations. There are pilots that were approved in the San Francisco Bay Area and Los Angeles. Those should be expanded statewide so that folks have options for taking different modes of travel into their place of employment. We should trial congestion pricing in certain urban areas and implement VMT fees. And I want to pause here and note that as we explore these types of options, we also have to make sure that public transit is a viable alternative, because otherwise we'll be penalizing folks for taking their automobile when they may not have any rightful alternative to doing so. And then finally, pricing parking appropriately is something that we've got to explore. That may include removing mandatory minimum parking requirements for new developments. It may mean that municipalities explore dynamic pricing for their parking to make sure that when demand is high, prices go up and folks can consider alternatives. Now, finally, just a pivot, we support increased integration with shared mobility providers, but we do think that if public dollars are going to be going toward that purpose, we ought to make sure that we're getting a base level of data from those providers. Having individual trip level data is important. We'd be advocating for the state to establish baseline access standards for trip level data, but also to allow municipalities to establish their own requirements if the circumstances on the ground require it. And these types of things are important because it would allow transit agency or transit authority to better understand how these new shared mobility options are interacting with existing traditional transit service, could lead to adjustments in that service. It also allows us to better monitor the efficacy of these partnerships and make sure that we know exactly what we're getting with the public dollar. So with that, I'll close and look forward to the discussion.
Well, I think you would agree we've heard a lot of great thoughts. I thought this would happen. I didn't have a chance to review the PowerPoints prior to today, but I thought that we would see some recurring themes. We have seen that, and I think some very, very, very good ideas. I also think it's very clever, Michael, the way you turned your 3 recommendations with your sub-bullets into about 10 recommendations, so way to go. I'm going to keep my comments limited because I know that there are many in the audience who are eager to ask some questions. So with that, I would like to ask that do we have any questions, first of all, from the commissioners? And I see that we do.
Thank you all for your presentations. I really appreciate it. Doran, I'm going to ask you to clarify your points you made. Number one, I guess I didn't hear a clear path to increase ridership in your presentation. Number two, if you don't want to be measured by Farebox revenue, which you made a case for, how should the outside measure your agency?
Somebody way better at tech than me. Thank you. I think, let me start backwards. I think the issue of Farebox, I think we should be looking at what the ridership is looking like. Some of the things that we're exploring in terms of boosting ridership are either reducing or eliminating fares for certain segments of the population. So one of the things, and I'm not sure we're going to do this, but we're looking at, for example, perhaps giving free rides to folks that are 12th grade and below, in terms of encouraging ridership at that level, getting them on board the system. We have partnerships with colleges, and we're trying to expand those partnerships with colleges. What we're hoping to do is instill the transit habit in people early on so that they'll keep going. In LA County's case, we have 4 half-cent sales tax measures, so we're able to supplement the Farebox. So the Farebox measurement isn't as big of a deal for us because of our ability to supplement with local dollars. But ultimately, I think we have to be really looking at how much ridership are we able to generate, how many vehicle miles traveled are we able to divert. That, to me, is the biggest measure of success in terms of what we're doing from a transit standpoint. I think in terms of how we get there, again, we have to look at different market segments. Are there ways that we can attract people to the system? And again, one of the biggest issues we face is where are there ways that we can improve our travel time to be able to get people there faster? One time, the El Monte Busway was a method that folks could get downtown on transit 20 to 30 minutes quicker than using the private auto. But we've now allowed electric vehicles, we've allowed tolling, we've allowed a lot of other folks to get into that lane so that any travel time advantage we have on that particular lane is completely vanished. In many cases, you'll have someone sitting on a bus that's actually sitting and the free flow traffic is going quicker. It doesn't take long for people to start changing their travel patterns based on those kinds of things. So it's really about a combination of what we can do from a ride quality standpoint, but from a broader system standpoint, what can we do to better manage the system to give people a transit advantage?
Thank you. Austin, you had in one of your slides of how the psychology of decision making that goes into people, and just to make sure I understand what it said, it basically people make a decision first on timeliness. How quickly do I get there? So which may tie into convenience, and then price. Is that what I heard your presentation clearly?
That's right. Obviously, talk about the entire California economy. There's obviously differing priorities and perspectives, but not just price and convenience, but the actual user experience and the reliability of it we see as a driving factor here. So obviously people are responsive to price. people responsive to how quickly can I get there, but the actual user experience itself, we've seen through tons of market research is a driving factor for many folks. I did glaze over my specific recommendations, so just for one moment here. One, housing density near transit is something that we see as obviously a huge factor that from a state policy perspective can change decision making. We see a direct correlation between people, public transit ridership in certain communities and ridership of our own product, because it is a driving force of getting people out of their own personal vehicle. Two is support mobile integration. I think Michael's slide deck showed a great demonstration of what that looks like and kind of where we're at in time. And third, supporting first mile, last mile through subsidies. I think it's still very early days there, but that's one thing where, seeing a direct incentive towards that. We've actually done it with SAC-RT through a partnership. We've done it with about 30 transit agencies across the country, but that small incentive can actually get people started with seeing what that first mile, last mile connectivity can actually look like from a user perspective.
Okay, I just wanted to be clear that in the hierarchy of, because I think your company probably has a real glimpse into the hierarchy of how we psychologically make a decision.
Sure.
And so I think that's, hopefully you're willing to share what's really behind that, because that kind of gives a clear indication of how people are making decisions, and that probably makes how we should be changing transit to increase ridership.
Yeah, so to answer that more specifically, convenience is a huge factor. I think our user base is largely middle class to wealthy. We're with our pool product, especially in communities like LA, there's a huge trend towards, I think it was mentioned by Doran, there's just a growth of individual car ownership. But in that sense, we've subsidized very heavily our pool product, trying to get people to share a car. I mean, sometimes it's less than half of the actual cost of our traditional UberX products. But even then, it sort of failed to penetrate in some markets because it would take 20 to 30 minutes longer to get to a destination across the Southland. So I think it's worth, in terms of the hierarchy, to really consider the convenience of time as a driving factor, and obviously price being, I think, a close.
Well, as the economy's stronger, do we value our time more than we used to value our time?
Right, and I think that's highly dependent upon the circumstances, but we have data that can actually demonstrate sort of where those breakpoints are and how it can inform decision making. And so I think given the movement towards the mobile interface, I think any situation in which you can, we obviously use dynamic pricing. That's not true in all transit agency settings, but where you can also show real-time awareness of how long it's going to take you to get from A to B is going to help drive decision making in a direction that's, I think, towards better use cases.
And a question, anyone can pick up on this one, last one, forgive me for dominating this portion, but we're investing tremendously into electric buses. Ridership is trending down. Where do we have the oh my goodness on the graph, where if the trend continues and we're doing this increasing spending on EV buses, where we're saying, okay, maybe we need to stop and reassess the, we made a cake, but no one likes our cake.
Well, I'm going to toss it over to Michael, but I'll start by saying that we've had that conversation. Michael and I and other transit agency CEOs have traveled up and down the state and met with Air Resource Board members, as well as other influencers in the community, and just discussed that. It is an expensive proposition, and really our core business is putting service on the street. So I don't know I have a specific answer, but I would like to at least offer that.
Yeah, I think that one of the tragedies of the development of the innovative clean transit regulations, it kind of refocused folks' attention away from these really core issues of declining ridership into new technology. And for Doran, Donna, and I, who spent the last 4 years negotiating with ARB this specific rule, that required a kind of an all-hands-on-deck effort by everyone in the transit community to try to get the rule to be in a place where it could be implemented with the least amount of friction. Now, that was still an enormous effort to negotiate the rule, let alone actually implement it. And I think that one of the things that we're going to see is that for every COO or CEO or general manager at transit agencies, their focus is unfortunately going to be around learning rate design and infrastructure investment as opposed to looking at strategies to turn the ridership equation around. Now, I think that there are a few juncture points that are built into the rule, things that we had advocated for to perhaps revisit its scope, its drive, and that would be right before every purchase mandate goes into effect. So it's a scaled up purchase mandate that begins as soon as 2023 and that goes up every 3 years thereafter, 25, 50 to 100%. And the ARB will be looking at the challenges to electrification. And part of that will be focused on the cost and its impact on operations. But I think it should also include an examination of where are we in terms of ridership. And hopefully that will provide an opportunity, a release valve, for us to reevaluate the scope if it's necessary. I mean, it could be the case, and I think that the proposition that ARB has presented is that once we get over this initial hurdle, the lessons learned will allow agencies across the state to make this transition without much friction. We hope that that is the case, but right now we're not seeing it. So if everything happens as ARB has envisioned, then maybe we don't have to revisit the scope of the regulation. Maybe it won't have much impact on ridership. But for the time being, we're a bit nervous of where this might lead.
So as we're passing the mic down among the commissioners, I'd like to invite those of you in the audience who have questions to go ahead and take advantage of this time to stand up and line up in front of the microphones out there for the audience, please.
Okay, I'll be quick because I really do want to listen.
I didn't mean to hurry you.
No. It's fine, but I struggle with the initial question of ridership and how much of your all's time is devoted to the other objective. We may get to the point where nobody's on these beautiful buses, so therefore I'm not sure how much credit we're really going to get. So how do we, I think really, and I look at Uber and Lyft and our technology companies certainly know customer loyalty. I mean, they send me, if I don't use Uber as often as one of the competitors, these guys know it, and they're stalking me and giving me a little incentive to come back, and I price shop because I'm price sensitive. But how do we, in the meantime, help you? Because at the end of the day, for all of us, if we're all collectively going to reduce vehicle miles traveled, we need to fill up every bus. We need to fill up every TNC vehicle, and that's not just going to happen without folks really putting some customer loyalty. You know, we haven't had any discussion about who do we lose. Okay, we saw Doran's number, but were those all transit-dependent folks who had no other choice? Well, none of us can really run a business if the only customers we have no other choices. I mean, that's called a monopoly, and we see how that works. And so I think for all of us, we want folks to be choosing that new double-decker bus. If Doran gets one of those, I prefer he get his other buses filled up first, but that's okay. We'll have that discussion. But, I mean, what's it going to take for all of us collectively? And we haven't talked at all about our private partners. I'm guessing those Google buses are pretty full. And we haven't talked at all about what happens. Should we try to have more of the private partners? And I think they did that out of necessity. I don't know that they ever wanted to really be into the transit business, but what can we learn and how can we help each other? And that was way too long for a short question.
Well, I think kind of looping back a couple of threads here. When I look at our service and I look at the future of where fixed route transit's going, where we can be successful is running high frequency, high quality service, maybe on a double deck bus, maybe not, But there's a lot of service that we run that really our partners at the TNCs could run better, where we're running a big bus with relatively low numbers of boardings. Those are the kinds of services that, whether it's an Uber-type vehicle or whether it's a jump bike or whether it's some other method to make that connection, we can make that connection. Where we need to spend our time and energy is figuring out how do we balance our social service role with the profit role that our private providers have in terms of meeting both of those needs. So some of our service is low ridership, but it's coverage ridership for the people that don't have a choice. If we can still take care of all of our riders and do it in some different ways, I really think we can boost ridership. And if I can run a route that's running every 10 minutes versus every 30 minutes, it makes it that much more attractive. But we've got to figure out collectively, how do we accomplish, again, our social service role, balancing that with a for-profit role, and ultimately changing the way that we do things to make it all come together.
I would just add, I know public-private partnerships is a really overused term in the policy world, but the true high-functioning private-public partnership in our space is really yet to be fully developed yet. And so I mentioned a few of them, but there are real regulatory incentives for us. There's real marketplace incentives for us to integrate fully with transit. And I think that annoying email you get in a future world could be, but seriously, it could be pushed towards. I think the jump experience is really important. We launched Jump in Sacramento, and it was a foundation of a whole bunch of customer acquisition that for folks that are not the traditional Uber users. And that same sort of experience can be built out in transit. Is who is Uber not serving well, and sort of what is their best use case, and then developing a platform through which it becomes obvious when transit is the best option to get from A to B and help steer folks in that direction. Because I think there are aligned incentives there. There's certainly a road of good policy to get to that point where all the incentives are aligned there.
And if I can jump in here, one of the other things I think that's important to remember is that when it comes to public transit service, there's always this tension between frequency and coverage, where folks are having to make a decision. If you're in a transit boardroom or you're a transit CEO or general manager, should I focus on increasing frequency to make sure that we're getting those riders who are going to be the highest propensity riders, or should I make sure that I'm providing that social service that Doran mentioned and cover as much of the map as possible? And as you can imagine, many transit agencies are pushed into considering more and more coverage because of the composition of their boards. These are city council members, county board of supervisors, and so they're being charged with doing things that are inherently inefficient. I think one of the interesting propositions that Uber and Lyft provide is that it can perhaps allow transit agencies to do both, to focus on that high frequency service in those urban cores, and for those areas that are more suburban or exurban, make a transition to something that is demand responsive, that can be subsidized at a lower level, and also provide better service. I think one of the things that was impressive about SAC-RT's findings is not only were they able to increase boardings for a previously existing service, but they were able to really boost customer satisfaction, and I think that's a win-win proposition. And so I think increasingly, as we see more trials of partnerships with Uber and Lyft and microtransit providers, we may find ourselves at a point where transit agencies feel comfortable focusing on that high frequency service and also being able to provide that coverage. And the last thing I would just note is the infrastructure question that many of us hit on, I think, is absolutely huge. If we've got bus-only lanes, if we've got traffic light prioritization, all those things are going to be really instrumental in making sure that our travel times come down relative to automobiles. And I think one of the best testimonials for taking public transit is when you're stuck in traffic and you see a transit vehicle whiz by you, whether that's light rail or intercity passenger rail. I know I was coming back from the Bay Area just this past Friday. I was on a Capital Corridor train that was going 80 miles an hour, and I saw everyone on the causeway going about 25 miles an hour, and I felt very good about my decision.
Mm-hmm.
I would just like to add in the I would like to just add that in the rural areas, when you get a cost per trip of $118, it's better to partner with a private provider, and that's what we're going to be looking at. We've had several routes, and there's nothing worse than having an empty bus 1 or 2 seats occupied out of a 22-passenger or 40-passenger bus. And what we have found out is that we need to look at different types of services that are dedicated to individual communities that only serve those that can render the ridership and drop those costs down. We do self-monitoring. We know what our hourly rate is. We know what the cost per mile, the cost per passenger. And at the end of the day, when you're looking at the cost of $118 per passenger, and we know that one of the private providers could do it for a lot less, that's where we have to go. We're even looking at assigning electric vehicles to self-help enterprises, to certain NGOs that can better serve their own community that are outside major metropolitan areas, Fresno, in small rural communities, and say you got a housing tract that is administered by self-help enterprises as just a reference, and they have a ridership potentially of 50, 60, 80 people. It may be better to assign them a vehicle, a $40,000 vehicle, work out a business plan where they can provide that service, and then we can dedicate our services to inner city routes that have less stops. Everything's about range, stop, time, and efficiency. And in the rural area, it just takes that much longer. We don't have the congestion, and we don't sit idle, but we have that distance and time.
And going back to the beginning when I talked about how transit agencies over the past 10 years have had to reduce service because we had reduced funding, the recession was hard on us. At San Joaquin RTD, we lost 25% of our operating budget almost overnight. And that happened not just to us, but to many transit agencies. We all had to look at reducing service. We reduced the lower productivity services, but those were some of the routes that connected people to other services. So we had a reduction in services. We're looking for new options. We're not sitting on our hands. We are definitely looking for partnerships. So did I get all the commissioner questions in? I think so. Karen, thank you for being the brave first question.
Sure. Karen Philbrick, Minetta Transportation Institute. What an outstanding panel. Let me just start by saying that hard stop, great comments from everybody. Austin, clarifying question for you. I thought I heard you say something about incentivizing Uber drivers to get people to transit. What did I hear? What were you talking
sorry about that. So what I was referring to in my recommendations is subsidizing first mile, last mile connectivity on the rider side. So, for example, SAC-RT, we had a partnership with SAC-RT for a number of years where you'd get a $5 incentive on the rider side pricing to start or end a trip at an RT hub. And that was meant, it was a basis of a data sharing relationship to understand how impactful was that, how much was it driving folks being picked up or being dropped off at transit. And we have about 50 of these across the United States, and it does show, I think, over time, that awareness that you can get that incentive, all costs considered, of going from A to B, using transit as sort of an intermediary leg of that trip. It helps drive people in that direction. Is that a sustainable long-term solution? I think it's to be determined, but it's one way in which you know that you can actually prove out this use case. The transit agencies can see the impact of that from some baseline, and we can kind of learn together in that regard. So yeah, not towards drivers, it's rider facing.
Hi, good afternoon. Shreyas Jethur with the Workforce Development Board. Also want to echo the praise for the presentations this afternoon. Thank you for everybody's insights and recommendations. I have several questions, and since there's nobody else in line, I think I'm going to just keep going.
Well, only that I haven't checked for online questions, and we are running out of time, but we welcome your interest.
All right, excellent. Well, thanks for that guidance. So I guess maybe I'll pick on just a few. I was curious, Dorn, if you could speak to any relationship that you guys are experiencing or witnessing, or Donna as well, in terms of ridership experience or quality of that ridership or transit experience and zero emission buses. Len Engel at various ICT regulation workshops would say, and perhaps anecdotally offer, that there were some riders that would wait for the battery electric bus, which is extremely uncommon. They would see a bus go by and wait for the next one because it's battery electric. Quieter, smoother ride, etc. Better for the drivers, I imagine, as well. So is there really no relationship? Is it we don't have enough data to substantiate that, or where are we at in understanding that relationship?
I think from the rider standpoint, when we launched our electric buses, we had 3 of 9 buses on our line 291 that were electric. And we would have some customers that would wait. It was novel, it was new. We're now running that line completely electric. So really, there's no reason to wait if you're going to ride on that particular line. As we introduce electric buses on new lines, there's a little bit of a novelty, but what we find is that at the end of the day, what the customers want is a vehicle that's going to be comfortable and on time. And they don't really care how that's happening. There could be little hamsters running in the back as long as it gets them there. That's ultimately the key. So I think there's a little bit of a novelty piece to it. But again, what customers really value is, did the bus show up on time? Did I have a comfortable ride or not?
Ditto. No, same
Okay.
answer.
Well, then I'll just, can I do one more real quick?
Sure.
Okay, great. So I'm curious also about, how do we enhance, the rider's experience? And it strikes me that we're listening to, essentially, management from transit agencies, but workers, the operators, are the closest to the riders. And I'm curious, have you engaged workers in this conversation? Do they have insights that we're not hearing? What does that process look like? What are the results of those conversations, if any, with those who are most closest to the riders?
May I clarify, is your question related to ridership declines or to electric vehicles?
Ridership.
Okay.
And growth declines. And stuff.
Well, I can tell you that we've been working with our operators and frontline people quite extensively, talking about the quality of the service that we're providing. It isn't just about the bus running on time. I tell our folks, and we have a campaign, we need to provide extraordinary customer service because we're only there if our customers are there. So really reminding the operators that that's what it's about. Driving safely is important, and providing extraordinary customer service is right up there. Those are the big two things we expect. So, any other answers?
Yeah, one of the experiences that we've noticed recently has been the disabled community. We're seeing a lot of elderly. Think so? Yeah. One of the experiences we've noticed is with the disabled individuals and elderly. We're finding out that a lot of elderly individuals are living at home for longer periods of time. They have mobility devices. We have front kneeling buses. They're very independent. Most elderly people are stubborn, as we all know. They don't want to ride with an attendant. They need help and assistance. And we have a policy where the drivers have to get out of their seat, go down to the bus, and stand there in the event that they need assistance. They don't touch them, they don't do anything, but we've noticed a decline in incidences that have dropped from probably 98 to 100%. In the last year, we've had maybe 3 incidences. They were minor nature. Prior to that policy, we probably had 1 a week, 2 a week, and some of them resulted in claims. So we get feedback from the drivers as to what works, what doesn't. But back to your question about assisting, and it could affect the ridership as well. There are some residents out there who ride buses that do not want any assistance. They don't even want to put on their seat belts. So we have to work with them in a very, very gentle manner, respecting their dignity and humanity, to try and get them to work with us, because safety is the #1 thing. So sometimes when we do take disciplinary action and we don't let a passenger ride for whatever reason, we got to get them back on the system, and hopefully they cooperate with some of these compliance issues. And it's all about safety and trying to get them from one location to another in a safe manner.
I would just add really briefly as it relates to workers. Our driver base, we survey pretty frequently, and one common theme is always a self-awareness that they're providing mobility to someone who's otherwise challenged for either, it's in a mobility desert where public transit doesn't serve well, it's to the disabled community, it's during late night hours when they know it's otherwise, going to lend itself to unsafe outcomes. That's a real trend. I think that ability for drivers to choose when and where they drive is something that actually is a really interesting observation as it relates to how does this fit into the broader world of mobility.
Thank you.
Just real quick, Donna, as a coach operator starting in the business, I can tell you the coach operators know best what's happening out there. We also do a lot of interface with our coach operators. And for the most part, our coach operators can tell us which routes are not performing well, where the challenges are. But it gets back to, I think, Michael, you mentioned the issue of coverage. If we have a route that has very low ridership, the operators will be the first ones to tell us that. But cutting that route means those people that are depending on that would not have that particular service. And again, I think that's where we've really got to think about these new models in terms of how do we deliver that service in a different way, still meet our social service requirements, but do it in a way that's more cost effective and get to that higher frequency service on key corridors.
Excellent. Thank you. It's always exciting to be pushing up against the ending time. I'm jumping into a little of your time, Chair Inman here. But I do believe we have a couple of questions from online. And again, it's exciting that people are engaged. Thank you for the engagement.
We do have one question from online. Randy Chin, Chief Consultant, Senate Transportation Committee. The reinvention of public transit will impact employees. How do you coax reluctant transit employee unions to be partners in the reinvention?
That's a softball question. I know one of you will take that one.
Well, again, I think from our standpoint, and we could probably spend a few more hours going through the complexity of transit funding and how it all works. At the end of the day, at least for our organization, we expect that there's going to continue to be the same amount of service. It's a matter of how we deploy that service and how we interface with new providers and new partners to better make that service real. So I think that the jobs are going to change, the role of labor will change, but it's always going to be very, very important in terms of how we deliver service. The same thing with technology. In some respects, there are new jobs, new positions, new skill sets that we need as we move into zero-emission vehicles. So while a mechanic might be doing a particular job today, we need to be leaning in to help train those mechanics, those service providers, to do the job of tomorrow using a clean fuel technology.
Good answer. You're always so diplomatic. Thank you. It certainly is an issue dealing with, having effective relationships with our labor unions as we see a transition in the service offerings. Allison.
Thanks. A great panel. I just was wondering if the topic of housing and land use hasn't come up at all in the conversation, and it seems remiss. I mean, I know I sympathize with our transit providers trying to provide, especially in rural areas, trying to provide good transit service. But how do we? Seems like the only way to increase ridership is to make sure we're connecting where people live to where they need to go. And if you could talk about any role you're playing in the land use housing discussion, I'd appreciate it.
Well, I can say that that discussion is happening, not in this panel, but it's something we talk about very frequently, housing, transit-oriented development, and the homelessness issue as well. So those are other big problems or challenges that we're tackling. But I'd invite other responses.
FCRTA is working with the local metropolitan planning organization, Fresno Council of Governments, and they offer transit-oriented development funding applications which really initiate private development projects to put housing developments on fixed routes or near a fixed route. There's also other incentives because keep in mind that the electric vehicle technology goes beyond just the fixed route. We want to encourage the residents to also partake in that because the air districts offer vouchers for residents, especially in disadvantaged communities. So they're encouraged to put in electric charging locations. We also put in bus shelters in these housing tracts to promote the ridership. It gets pretty warm there in Fresno, 108, 106 this last couple days. And a lot of individuals need to have a place to wait for the bus. We put them next to health facilities as well. So that is a very good question. We try to align our routes to a lot of the mixed-use, high-density type apartment complexes, and also destination locations, whether it's commercial retail or regional retail as well.
I would just add that as a little bit of a cautionary tale, the housing challenge in the state, tied to the homelessness challenge in the state, which is something that spills over into what we do. But from a housing standpoint, we always talk about high-density housing at transit hubs, which I do think is important, but we have to make sure we get it right. And as an example, there's a 500-unit housing complex that was built literally adjacent to our administrative offices. It's right on a major transit corridor. We thought, wow, this is great. All of this housing sitting right on a major transit corridor, virtually no ridership coming from it. And it has to do with the type of housing, with the pricing of that housing. So just putting density near transit stations doesn't always necessarily drive transit ridership. Again, don't take me wrong, I'm not saying we shouldn't do it, but we really have to be thoughtful about how we put this together in a way that ultimately links housing with trip and travel patterns that gets us to where we want to go.
I would just add, as I mentioned earlier, we're certainly supportive of state policy that pushes more density near transit. There is a direct correlation between, people whose use cases is well served by transit and our business. It's not just that it's good for business, it's also that, a lot of the ridership we may see that does compete with transit is because there's a design issue where the use case is just not efficient enough for people to actually reliably base their whole life around it. And if you think about other sort of ancillary policies like congestion pricing, the concept I was talking about of showing somebody on a screen the obviousness of what is the best option for you, something like congestion pricing layered on top of that will make the right use cases even more obvious. And I think long-term, that's really the direction we should be moving. And this sort of mobility integration sort of will help bring those policies to life in a way that has less of the clumsiness that we see based on all the behavioral pattern stuff we were talking about.
Well, in the interest of keeping this on time, I'm afraid I have to cut off the questions, but I would tell you that, okay, one more. I've been vetoed. Jose is a tough taskmaster. He's been, holding up the cards, but
Very quickly, okay. I'm just curious, specifically for Austin, but for all members of the panel, and thank you again for your time. Has Uber already been approached with the notion of partnering with public transit and such that any kind of subsidy kind of situation to Uber for any kind of gap service, like first mile, last mile, and whether Uber and transit would be open to such an arrangement?
So absolutely. I think we view that as sort of the next frontier of our business. Have we been approached? I think it's largely been one-offs with specific transit agencies. So we've yet to fully kind of integrate around a uniform approach that we can take to every transit agency. Kind of going back to the reality that rural California is still different than San Francisco, but I think we're absolutely open to it and eager to talk about whatever use cases you think can be built out where we can be helpful.
So what I was going to say is that I know the panelists would be happy to stay a few extra minutes. So if you have any questions you haven't had an opportunity to have answered, I know I speak for all of us. We'd all be happy to stay and talk a little bit longer. But I am going to bring it to a close right now. Thank you for letting me blame you, Jose, for. I do want to say a few things before I close. First of all, thanks to the CTC for hosting this event, for asking our opinions, and most importantly, for listening to what we have to say. I do appreciate this opportunity. I was honored to be asked to moderate such an esteemed panel of my colleagues. I hope our ideas and our presentations have been useful and helpful, and I want to thank you for your attention and especially for all of the questions. And I'd like to ask you to help me thank this great panel for their presentations. Welcome back.
Perfect. Well, I don't know about you all, but I could stay all night and ask y'all questions. But a couple of things. One, when we talk about the housing, I think you're absolutely right. But with due respect for our fellow Commissioner Lucy Dunn, she reminds us that houses are where jobs go to sleep at night. So I think we really have to continuously remind ourselves of that jobs, housing, and I think that's so important for us. And I know the governor is very interested in all regional economic development plans. So I'm hopeful that we'll really take that holistic. And then secondly, on behalf of all of our commissioners, the whole category of super commuters just goes against our soul. And I think for all of us, the fact that we have needed to come up with a label, and we actually have a class of folks that commute by definition minimum 90 minutes one way, and it goes downhill from there, is just dreadful for all of us in the mobility world. So I'm excited to have these discussions. I think we're best when we listen and learn from each other and challenge ourselves what we can do and offer all of those options. And I love the stat that Sacramento has more jump rides than Uber and Lyft. I mean, that's just amazing to me. I'm going to get out there and try it, guys, but I need to bring my helmet just in case, But anyway, I want to give a big shout out to Jose and our CTC staff for really, takes a lot of work to get us here. It looks so easy once we're here, but Susan, Jose, all of you, thank you so much. And this is a couple of topics that we just really kind of scratched the surface on. I would engage everybody to get to know a new best friend from one of these panels, and let's make real progress together. So with all of that, to you watching us online, thank you. Send us your questions, comments, suggestions, what's keeping you up at night, and thank you. So